Hello, this is Cruising and Musing. I'm your host, Rob. We are rolling around in Studio B here during a very warm afternoon in Southwest Florida. Studio B is lacking air conditioning at the moment, but Studio A still hasn't come back from getting its power steering fixed, so we're making do with the windows down and staying where we can drive nice and slow. As we unwind a little bit from work and just kind of tour, the areas that are starting to get built up a little bit down here. So I've been meaning to do this video for a while, and this is sort of like a formulation of different books that I found very helpful, very informative, or very influential. And these are like the writings of these folks as well as the books. A lot of them, it's not just having read the books, but having heard them talk, speak publicly, and listened to them engage in discourse over the years, that I have found them to be very insightful, very moving, and very helpful to pay attention to. But we're going to start off with some classics. Obviously, I feel like every American should probably read the Constitution once a year to remind themselves of what's in it and what their prescribed rights are. This way, when they see what's going on in the world today, they know exactly, where it stands in regards to what's supposed to be the supreme law of the land. So, Constitution's number one on there, followed by some very unsurprising names, I'd imagine. We have Locke. So, John Locke, David Hume, Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, and Karl Marx. Yes, I am suggesting you read both The Wealth of Nations and the Communist Manifesto. You need to read both of them. It'll help with your understanding greatly and help reveal why some of those ideas are good, some of them are bad, and some of them deserve to be mixed together, and others of them deserve to be forgotten. And I will stand by that all day long. Next up on the list of people I have that you should read are two books. I cannot remember the authors' names for the life of me, but with current events being what they are in East Europe and the growing tensions and everyone, kind of getting on their gung-ho war wagon, I feel that these are very prudent to be read at this time, and this is Love Company and When We Were Young and We Were Soldiers. They're not the most graphic books out there, but they do a very good job of kind of explaining the perspective of what it means to be on the front lines, to be involved in working as a soldier, to see people die, and, as a reflection on what actually gets won when you pay those costs in lives. So that's my suggestion there, is let's get those two read as a matter of contemplation before you start suggesting other people's sons go off to die over what could be political debates. That said, I've mentioned being a huge fan of Christopher Hitchens previously, so obviously I'm going to recommend you read his works and listen to his talks. One of the most eloquently argued things I've heard him do was in terms of reparations on whether or not they should be paid. And that was back in the day before the internet, when they held such things as the Monk Talks and everything on C-SPAN or PBS. And he was on there with a panel of four and, made very good arguments and held his own against, four others, going back and forth on what they felt the right things were for people to be doing and not doing. So there's that suggestion. Also, followed in the line of Mr. Hitchens are three of the four so-called four horsemen of the militant atheist time, or neo-atheist movement, back in the early 2000s. The first one being Richard Dawkins. Now, you can read his atheist literature if you so care for. I understand if you happen to choose not to, but I would recommend you read it. And then also read his works on biology. The biology works are kind of a little more important, I would say, because it really helps, the theory understand evolution and human behavior in a way that just isn't explained by your high school biology teacher. And I really wish they were, but, unfortunately, it would probably rile up people too far on the right if we went into too much detail about explaining away altruism and other things that are supposed to be like divinely human traits and whatnot. Past that, I would also recommend Sam Harris. Now, Sam Harris is kind of a complicated figure. He, like I said, militant atheist, but still strongly believes in spirituality. So that here. Right. And so he believes heavily in spirituality still, despite not believing in God and being an atheist, and he tends to make arguments from that perspective of there's still like good spiritual things to be had out of everything. But his main works here are The End of Faith, which was written shortly after the Twin Towers came down, and then his book The Moral Landscape, which is an attempt to kind of parse some kind of moral guidance without using any sort of religion as a baseline for it, and how to kind of figure out how you can make moral judgments without resorting to non-logic or non-scientific ideals. We'll try to put it that way. Then he also has a piece that he's doing with our next author on suggestion. It's Conversations about the future of Christianity and Islam. And he did that as a dialogue that it was written as with Majid Nawaz. And I highly recommend you read Majid Nawaz's standalone book, Radical. Mr. Nawaz was a recruiter for the precursor to ISIS back in the early 2000s. He was heavily involved in the movement that led to the Arab Spring. And he spent a few years in jail for his involvement with that in Egypt with the overthrow of the previous Egyptian dictator. And now he runs an organization called Quilliam, where they work to de-radicalize other Muslims, because he was so moved by the kindness and humanity he was treated with by the Christian and atheist West that were trying to free him, because he was essentially a prisoner of conscience, having done nothing illegal, but still being disagreed with his viewpoints by the Egyptian government. Next on our list is Gad Saad. Gad Saad is a Lebanese Jew who is a refugee who fled that war and came to us. Well, not to us, but he lives in Canada now, and he is a evolutionary psychologist that works as a marketing professor in Canada. He has written a couple of very good books, one called The Consuming Instinct and the other called The Parasitic Mind. I absolutely recommend both of those. He's got a very dry sense of humor. He does a lot of self-aggrandizing that is meant tongue-in-cheek. And he also keeps a very active podcast, and he's active on social media and whatnot, giving his little bits of sassy commentary throughout the day to folks. Next down is a fellow you're going to probably be a little surprised to have on this list, Howard Bloom. And Howard Bloom was Prince's producer The artist formerly known as Prince, that fellow, Howard Bloom was his producer. And you're probably thinking, what's a music producer doing, writing things that Cruising and Musing is suggesting? Well, he has one book called The Lucifer Principle that kind of goes into some details of what he was about with the music industry and everything else, and how they decided what was hip and wasn't, and really helped shape pop culture going through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then he has a second book called The Genius of the Beast, which basically describes a emotional cycle of confidence that drives our boom and bust cycle in economics. And it's now been used by the Saudi court as like standard read, and since shortly after it was published, to help plan their financial moves and everything. So I highly recommend reading it. It's very insightful, especially coming from somebody who worked in an industry that, you know, made or break on how it could make people feel about their products. The next one up is Douglas Murray. He's a British author. The two works I would definitely recommend from him is the newest one, which is The War on the West, and his previous book, The Madness of Crowds, which really gets into how people can fall into groupthink and group urges and do things they wouldn't otherwise be capable of. In that same vein, Jonathan Haidt, or Haidt, that's H-A-I-D-T. He has a couple of books here, The Righteous Mind, The Happiness Hypothesis, and the one I consider the most important to myself out of there is The Coddling of the American Mind. Very much a message of, hey, we need to stop trying to take all the stumbling blocks out of the path of our children and start making our children tough enough to overcome those stumbling blocks, because, you know, we just kind of have this, we went from just having like a on reinforcement of being physically resilient to an like acceptance of being mentally on resilient, where, you know, people get upset and you know, are, you know, the screaming of I'm offended instead of arguing out your points and your counterpoints and everything, instead of just screaming I'm offended and not wanting to hear things that upset you. So Jonathan Haidt, Coddling of the American Mind, highly recommend. Next on our list is Jordan Peterson, The 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning. Jordan Peterson tends to be a little bit more of a controversial figure for reasons of dishonesty on his part of his detractors. He is in no way a neo-Nazi, what have you, the other things that have been said. It's just some very simple, old-fashioned conservative advice of getting your shit together and taking care of your problems and kind of seeing to yourself before you go and, you know, try to change the world. And also some good advice about being kind to others and being tolerant of others. So definitely would recommend that. Think of it like a self-empowerment almost story. And then his Maps of Meaning really works through, you know, the deeper like literature stuff and ties it back to psychology. Not something that you want to dive into on a whim. That one's like, if you're intensely interested in literature and what things represent, you know, have a good read on that one. But it is definitely heavy going. Next up on our list is Thomas Sowell. He is a African-American economist. He is in his 90s now, I believe. And he has been commentating on politics and the economy for years and years and years and years. And he has a lot of insightful things to say. So I would highly recommend you read his entire repertoire. But the ones I would recommend out of all of them that you read is the first book is a newer one called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And then the next one is an older one of his works called Intellectuals and Society. And then the oldest of the ones I'm going to recommend that you read of his is called The Economics of Politics and Race. And he really gets into the way that, we all share kind of the same troubles, and that people go out of their way to try to divide us along our lines and sell a false narrative that, the different outcomes we've enjoyed or suffered are driven by hatred instead of, mere chance or other factors. So it's just very nice to hear somebody arguing that, hey, humanity isn't rotten and that there are good people out there. Next on the list, I would recommend you read Andrew Yang's The War on Normal People. That is definitely a bit of insight there from a self-made man. And, he was a presidential candidate, running on the progressive ticket, so this might not agree with everything that you're thinking of, but he has some insights that I think are very valuable and are, undeniably true as well. Take a turn here. Colorful neighborhood as always. So let's see. Was there anyone left on this list I didn't get to? Oh yes, I saved one of the best for last. So the last one I'm going to recommend you read is going to be primarily if you're interested in prehistoric history and origins of culture stuff. And this is a fellow named Graham Hancock, who is a novelist but has also made it a full-time duty or job of his to go exploring around and looking at the different archaeological sites and digging down and digging deep into basically lost civilizations. His works, Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, America Before and Underworld, essentially involve him going around the world and looking at different ruins, investigating them, talking with the scientists who are working on those ruins and dating them. He makes a very strong argument, gathering all of these other different scientists together and unifying their stories into one voice, that Clovis first is not a viable solution, that there were humans in North America before the Barren Land Bridge, and that kind of is supported by the fact that they're finding things more and more in South America that indicate modern human inhabitation of the Americas as early as 33,000 years ago instead of 12,000 years ago, which would mean Paleolithic instead of Neolithic, which is kind of a huge change of things. And if you're the sort to enjoy podcasts, Joe Rogan did a podcast, or a series of them, with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson, where they talk about these things and discuss different theories on how all of this could come down and what it could possibly mean. Atlantis as an idea, not an actual place, having possibly existed, as well as a possible catastrophic impact of meteors, probably a number of small ones instead of one large one, into the Laurentide ice sheet that ended the last ice age, rather than a natural cycle. And this being the root basis of the Great Flood that is present in so many cultures. So, it's one of those highly interesting things that really has no true bearing on anything today, but more as an intellectual exercise of what might be and what our history might really be like. So I'd highly recommend that if that's the sort of thing that interests you. If not, skip over it. It'll probably just be in the textbooks when your kids or grandkids end up learning their ancient history. I feel like it's about 20-30 years out from getting into the mainstream stuff the kind of way it takes almost 20, 30 years for anything to get into textbooks. Might be a little bit longer if the Egyptologists have anything to say about it, which is a bit of an inside joke for those who know. Yeah, so that's the reading list I'm making my suggestions based on. Obviously, there's been more and others. I, lean very heavily on listening to great debates between, like, Bill Nye, Lawrence Krauss, and other intellectuals, Michael Schumer, Sam Harris, Gadsad, to pull a lot of these ideas from. So when you hear me talking and I'm talking about things that I seem to be all over the place, this is kind of why. I'm drawing ideas from all over. And if I did not mention it in the list of the historics, I would highly recommend reading both the Bible and the Quran so that you can understand better where people are coming from when they are deeply religious. And, if you're talking with people that are anti-religious and you're religious, having read the holy books will, help you have a more enlightened conversation about it. So that's been our cruise kind of through the hood and our discussion of reading material. If you've got any questions about any of these guys, do ask. And I'm going to make one final, and this will be the most controversial suggestion I'm going to suggest that anyone read. Go ahead and read The Bell Curve. Read it with an open mind. I was told that it was a racist, hateful book, and I read it just to see if that was so. And what I came away with was the big underscore that, there's more variance within any given population than between any given population. And the biggest impacts on intelligence that we can have on our children is to get them reading at an early age and to work with them consistently in their schoolwork. That, parental involvement was a bigger determining factor than race in any measure of anything, as well as socioeconomic status. That being involved as a parent in your child's education is going to be the big factor that determines how well they do. So that's kind of a final note, but, keep in mind that you got to read it and not go in with any foredrawn conclusions. And when the guy repeatedly says they found no difference in intelligence among race, and says it at the start and end of every chapter, believe him. He's the guy who did all the research and he says it's not there to be found. So I would take it at that. And that is our recommended reading and kind of listening list. And maybe we'll do one of these that's a little more lighthearted about good music and whatnot one day. Thanks for listening. I've been Cruising and Musing. Remember, like, subscribe, comment.